Hi there, welcome to session number 9, where we're going to be looking at setting and keeping boundaries. Now, this is a technique for reducing the impact that drug and alcohol using behaviour can have on you and your family. I'll come on in a moment and tell you exactly what a boundary is. I'll offer you some ideas about what you might want to set boundaries for. And then I'll share with you a little model that we've developed at Adfam for setting and keeping boundaries. Now, as ever, I'm going to be offering you general information, and you'll need to decide for yourself what of this session appeals to you, what looks hopeful, and what you may want to go off and experiment with the person you're concerned about. Okay, with that in mind, I'd like to come on and define what exactly is a boundary and why are they worth setting. Okay, so a boundary is a limit on what is reasonable. And it's for you to decide what you consider is reasonable and therefore what you might want to set a boundary around. An example of this could be where perhaps somebody nags you for money, which you believe probably won't get paid back and will be spent on drugs. Where you might set a boundary that runs something like, if you continue to nag me for money, I won't prepare food for you for a week. Now, why might you want to set and keep boundaries? Well, here's some thoughts for you. The first one is that they invite the person who's got into difficulty with their substance use to be more responsible for their behaviour. As we have seen in earlier sessions, where someone begins to experience the negative consequences of their choices around using, that can begin to nudge them to move around the cycle of change. Secondly, I think that boundary setting helps families to reduce the impact of substance using behaviour on their lives, such as where someone maybe shouts or argues or manipulates, bullies you, perhaps steals from you, even hits you perhaps. And then lastly, I think that boundary setting helps to break down those roles that family members can get stuck in. And some examples of this could be perhaps you've ended up being in the role of somebody's carer, which may not be a formal role, but it's one that somehow you've ended up taking on, and that may well come at some cost to yourself in terms of the stress and demands of taking on that role. And similarly, perhaps the person who's got into difficulty with their substance use has also got into a role where they have become dependent upon other family members. And through boundary setting, they're invited to be more responsible and less dependent. Okay, now as I just said, it's for you to decide what you might want to set boundaries about. But let me come on with you next and share some ideas about what other family members have found it useful to set boundaries for. So with that in mind, I'm going to come to the second slide. The first thing is perhaps giving somebody money, which very often doesn't get paid back and which often gets spent on buying drugs. Secondly is those things you provide that perhaps they could do for themselves, such as buying food and preparing meals, perhaps paying their bills, doing the laundry, and so on. Maybe you cover up for them, such as if they're drunk or have got a hangover, ringing into their workplace and saying that they're ill. And then allowing them in the home when they're under the influence, and perhaps that's particularly important to set a boundary around if there are children in the home, and similarly using illegal drugs in the home as well. And then that last point is having them to live with you when maybe you don't want them to, such as if there is domestic abuse. Now the choice is yours. It's for you to decide what you may want to set boundaries around, and what might be right for one family member may be different for somebody else. What's important is to pick the things that really matter the most, and maybe just to start with one or two small boundaries and then build up from there. I'd like to come on now and say something about how to set and then to keep a boundary. What I've found over the years, and I know my colleagues at Adfam have too, is that very often when families do boundary setting, it happens in the heat of the moment. It happens when somebody's angry and they say something like, "Oh, if you use drugs in the house again, I'm going to kick you out." Now that's an attempt to set a boundary. It's saying, isn't it, if you do something which I don't think is reasonable, there's a consequence. The trouble is, kicking somebody out is probably the last resort, and when it comes to it, can be very difficult to do. So the risk is the person who's got into difficulty with their substance use begins to realise that, yeah, family members set these boundaries, but they don't mean anything. Nothing ever happens. There's no consequence to me breaking the boundary. So with that in mind, Adfam have spent a long time thinking about how can families do this in a more effective way. And there's a little model that we've created that I'd like to share with you next. This model has 3 steps. The first one is to really take your time and to prepare the boundary. And I'll come on and say how to do that in just a moment. What we found is the more time people spend preparing the boundary, the greater is the chance that they will be able to set it effectively and to then keep it. Having spent time preparing, you then come on and actually set it with the person who's got into difficulty with their substance use. And again, I'll say more about how to do that in a moment. And that comes on to the third step, which is keeping the boundary. Often it's not enough just to set it. You have to notice if it's being kept, and it may well get broken, particularly when you first start doing boundary setting. And I'd just like to note that there is further information on boundary setting elsewhere on the Adfam website. There's one important thing I need to clarify about how to set and keep boundaries. If the person who's got into difficulty with their use is a young person under the age of 18, then maybe boundary setting doesn't apply, or perhaps more likely it would need to be done in an age-appropriate way. For example, considering the risks of them using outside of the family home, perhaps they're safer using inside, and except under exceptional circumstances, the young person would need to be living with their parents or caregivers. What I'd like to do with you next is to take each of those steps in turn and to say more about what to consider when setting and keeping a boundary. So with that in mind, let's come to the next slide, which looks at how to prepare a boundary. Okay, as I said earlier, I think it's important to really linger and take your time here. Usually the more time family members spend preparing a boundary, the greater is their chances of setting and then keeping it. Here are some ideas to think about. What is the behaviour that you want to set a boundary for? What is it that to you doesn't seem reasonable? Next, consider, are there any risks in setting a boundary, such as insisting someone doesn't use in the home, whereas they may be at more risk from using outside the home? Or indeed, might there be a risk to you in setting a boundary, such as there being an argument or a conflict, in which case I'd want to encourage you to watch session 10. The next thing to think about is what is the consequence for them if they break your boundary. Now the important thing here is to pick something that you know you will be willing to follow through on if the boundary gets broken. And this is something which you do which has a consequence for them. The kind of consequences that there might be that you could think about are things like where you prepare food for someone or you wash their clothes. Perhaps through you they get access to the television or the internet. Maybe they talk to you when they're having a difficult time and get support from you. And perhaps you could withdraw your support for a while. Consequences may be more severe as well, such as if someone is stealing from you, you may call the police. And perhaps you may even want to take out a court injunction that prevents someone from coming into your home. And that could be particularly helpful if you're on the receiving end of domestic violence. One other thing to think about, strangely, some family members find it helpful to ask the person who's got into difficulty with their substance use what they think the consequence should be. And quite often they'll come up with something more severe than you might think of. The next point I've got is, can other family members work with you? That helps to prevent divide and rule. Then how, when and where will you set your boundary? And you might want to think about session number 7, where we talk about communicating with someone who's got into difficulty with their substance use. Think through what's the likely response they're going to have to you setting a boundary, and think through how will you cope with that. The next thing to think about is how practical is this particular boundary for you to set at the moment, and how likely is it that they'll be able to keep it at the moment. And then lastly, think about what support do you need in order to be able to do this if it all feels a bit too challenging. Okay, having taken your time and perhaps talked things through with other family members too, and you feel that you've really prepared your boundary, know what the consequence is going to be and how you're going to set it, then you're ready for step number 2, which is setting a boundary. And I've got a few ideas just to help you with this, and I'll come on and share those next. The first thing to think about is, how will you communicate this to somebody? Will it be through a face-to-face conversation with them? But if that's not possible, or perhaps if that feels a bit scary or too difficult, or you don't think they'd be willing to do it, then you may want to do it by giving them a letter, sending them a text, an email, or some other way of communicating something to them. Next, you need to think about, are you willing to discuss and negotiate the boundary with them? And if you think that they won't do that, or they wouldn't do it in a genuine way, then you might want to think about, I'm just going to have to impose it. And that's a choice for you to make. If someone is willing to sit down and talk about it, there's probably more chance of it being kept. And of course, they may not be willing to sit down and talk about it. And then lastly, think about, who else might you want to be there when you set the boundary? Okay, having set your boundary, you then need to keep it. And sometimes family members find this the hardest step of the 3. So with that in mind, I'm going to come on to the final slide and share with you some ideas other family members have found helpful for how to keep a boundary. First of all, you need to notice whether it's being kept and not just assuming that someone is keeping it. If it is being kept, you may well want to thank someone for keeping your boundary. But if it's broken, I propose that you take your time and decide how and when to do the following things. I propose the first thing you need to do is you need to say that it's been broken, and perhaps you might want to add how you feel. If you don't do that, it's just going to be the elephant in the room. They'll probably know that they've broken it, and they will know that you have, and they'll know also that nothing's happened. So it matters that you say that it has been broken. Next, you need to implement the consequence you said there would be for it being broken. And if you don't do that, you'll lose credibility in their eyes, and they'll begin to think that you set boundaries but that you never actually keep them. That's why it matters back at that first stage, preparing the boundary, that you pick something that you know you will be able to follow through on if you get to this 3rd stage. The next thing I suggest is that you consider if you've learned anything from having set and then tried to keep the boundary, and to take that learning forward and to think about resetting the boundary. Well, those are the 3 steps of setting and keeping a boundary. I think often what happens is, rather than being 3 steps, it's something that becomes a cycle where someone goes round and round and round. So you prepare, you set, you keep, it gets broken, you learn from that, you prepare it again, you reset it, you try to keep it again, perhaps it gets broken again, you go around again. And that can be very demanding, can be quite stressful, so it's important to get the support that you need. But what many family members do find over time is that it creates a new precedent in your relationship with the person who's got into difficulty with their substance use, where they begin to realise that actually boundary setting actually really means something now, and there are consequences to boundaries being broken, and they begin to moderate their behaviour. That doesn't mean they're going to stop using drugs. They may well carry on doing so, but at least their behaviour has less of an impact upon you. Okay, I'd like to end in the way that I usually do, which is to encourage you to look elsewhere on the Adfam website, to look for sources of support in your area, because it can be quite difficult and demanding to do boundary setting. And it can also be helpful to have the services of a specialist family support worker as well, to guide you through how to do it in your particular circumstance. So wish you luck in your boundary setting if that's what you choose to do, and bye for now.